Are you in the market for a workbench, but also a sawhorse, and you're not too sure what to do? Well, this is where the 1.2-in-1 workbench and sawhorse could come in handy for you. So we're going to talk about some of the details, see if it's worth picking up or not, and go from there. By the way, I did get this from WDOT as a gift, so I don't have to return it or anything. Anyways, let's go ahead and dive into this product and see what's up with it. So like I mentioned, this is a 2-in-1 product. So it can function both as a traditional work table as well as a sawhorse. And with that, actually, you see a bunch of like holes and pre-drilled holes basically on the table itself. So that is to help mount tools like saws or drills, as well as kind of give you a compact workstation for any kind of extra tools. And they do have a few that arrive with it, which is pretty handy. So I'll talk about those in a second. Now it's mostly made from plastic. However, it does have a pretty good design that supports up to about 500 pounds. So it's nicely reinforced. So when you're kind of pushing around on it, it does moves back and forth a little bit. I think a lot will, but I do feel very confident that you can put your full weight on it and whatever kind of task you're doing, and you should be pretty well off without having to worry about collapsing on you in any way. Now, as far as the extra tools go, like I had highlighted earlier, it does come with actually 2 clamps as well as 6 bench dogs, along with multiple positioning slots. So the bench dogs are on the bottom tray and kind of in there. You can just pull them up. So they're really meant to help balance like wood or like anything you're going to be using, kind of like wedge it in between that and the clamp. It really helps just secure a lot of different shapes and sizes of projects or material that you're using. And for the quality of both of those, I actually thought they were pretty decent. The clamps are a little bit sticky, so when you kind of are using it back and forth, I've used better clamps. You can get better clamps if you have clamps, but if you don't have clamps, why not have them? I actually technically don't own clamps myself, so why not have them myself? But if I did own clamps, there are better options out there. These are they will tie you over. However, they do slip into the bottom of the Sawhorse workbench, which is great for storage. Makes it super easy, along with the bench dogs as they go into the holes that are there. Now, though this is not the smallest nor most portable, it does collapse down pretty nicely. So it does have a decently simple profile to be able to store away in your garage or a small workspace. And if you do want to travel with it, you can always throw it in the trunk of your truck or your work van or car, and that'll make it a little easier to be able to carry about with you. It does stand pretty tall. And so this one is a little bit bulkier, but then again, it does also have a table. So you kind of got the trade-off there. And as far as assembly and setup goes, it's actually really simple. So you do have 2 little bars on the side that go up with the table, and then they click into place. And then the rest kind of extends out with it. And then when you're collapsing it down, you have 2 little buttons, one on each side of the arms. And so you take one, make sure you're kind of holding the metal bar underneath. So you take it, you clip it, and it'll go down smoothly and clip into place on the leg of the workbench, and then same with the other side. And now you might have to lift up the middle piece to make sure that it kind of all collapses back down, but it seems to be pretty stable when it is collapsed down and easy to be able to set up. You just kind of pop it open and it's pretty quick. Now, I will say that I do worry about pinching with my fingers in between. It's a sharp plastic, and I don't know. I haven't done anything yet, but there is a chance, and I don't want to do that. So I think that there is an opportunity to pinch yourself pretty badly if you're not careful. So be careful. Now, if you are looking for some extra little features that I don't know if everyone's going to use, but some people might. This does have a laser engraved measurement scale on it, as well as a built-in storage shelf underneath to help keep tools organized. And then as far as the scale goes, it'll just kind of help you with measuring and cutting how you see fit. But I do like that these little divots in the middle, they are perfectly fit for the clamps that come with the table. Now, I will say that I did accidentally snap one of them by messing around with it too much. I couldn't figure out how to get undone. Really silly. And I figured it out now, but unfortunately I had to glue that back together. So don't test it too hard. And really, there's not much more to say about this. I thought it was pretty decent. It is a little bit bulkier than I would have preferred or expected. However, because it's a 2-in-1 and you do get the workbench as well as the sawhorse, I think that that's kind of the trade-off that you have there. And so I would have also loved to get 2. I did get only 1. That would have been nice, but you do have to, they only do come with 1. So keep that in mind too. But otherwise, I thought it was pretty handy. The fact that it's so stable and can provide that much stability for about 500 pounds of weight is going to be really nice. And I do love the fact that for what it is, a work table is fairly compact. So if you don't have a big workspace at home, or you have a garage that's multi-purpose and you do need to kind of put things away when you're done with a project, this could be really nice to be able to have a full table set up for yourself while also being able to tuck it away and put it to the side or store it away when you're done. So I hope this information helped you out in picking out a good Sawhorse for yourself or a workbench. Until next time, I'm Andrew Frech, and yeah, have a good day. And by the way, if you do like my content, feel free to give this video a like or subscribe to my channel. It always helps out. Until next time, have a great one. Bye.